The sun was a hammer, and the town of redemption was the anvil, a place where hope was beaten thin and brittle. It beat down on the raw timber of the saloon, on the dust that was as fine and suffocating as powdered bone, and on the stiff, inappropriate silk of May's dress. She stood beside the saloon's warped hitching post, a splash of crimson and jade in a world bleached to shades of brown and gray. The dress, a relic from a life that now felt like a fever dream, clung to her skin, its vibrant colors a mockery of the cage she was in. She had been delivered here 2 days ago, a piece of human freight left on the platform until her purchaser, a Mr. Silas Stone, had finally come to collect her. He had looked her over with the flat, assessing eyes of a man pricing livestock, his lips thin with disappointment. She was not the porcelain doll he had been promised in the letters from San Francisco. Her face was too wide, her eyes too sharp and intelligent, her hands calloused from work her father had deemed unsuitable for a daughter meant for trade. She was a flawed product, a failed investment her father had offloaded onto the Western territories. Mr. Stone had grumbled, paid the man who brought her a fraction of the agreed upon price, and then deposited her here, at the edge of this desolate settlement, with a single instruction. Wait, he had business inside the saloon, a thick stew of stale whiskey, sweat, and desperation that she could smell from the street. So she waited, an ornament of flesh and bone, feeling the stares of the townsfolk like insects crawling on her skin. They saw the dress, the color of her hair, the shape of her eyes, and saw a thing, not a person, a curiosity, a commodity. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was an old companion. It had lived with her through the long sea voyage, through the squalor of the port city, through the rattling train journey that had shaken the very soul from her body. Beneath the fear, however, was a core of something else, something hard and unyielding. It was the quiet resolve of a weed that insists on growing in a crack in the pavement. She would survive this. She would endure the hammer of the sun and the anvil of this town. She watched the way the wind sculpted the dust into fleeting shapes, the way a hawk circled in the merciless blue sky. She cataloged the faces of the men who passed, their expressions ranging from crude interest to outright contempt. She was an observer, always. It was her only weapon. Hours bled into one another, measured by the slow westward crawl of the shadows. The initial sting of humiliation had cooled into a dull, persistent ache. Mr. Stone had not emerged. The sounds from the saloon grew louder, more discordant. A burst of laughter like shattering glass, a sudden shout, the tinny lament of a poorly played piano. She understood, with a certainty that chilled her despite the heat, that she had been forgotten. Or worse, she was the subject of the laughter, a punchline to a joke she had not yet heard. The thought did not make her weep. Tears were a luxury, a currency she could not afford to spend. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin a fraction, and focused on the horizon, where the land stretched out into an infinity of heat haze and emptiness. It was a terrifying vista, but it was honest in its desolation. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was: vast, indifferent, and deadly. A man finally emerged from the saloon, not Mr. Stone, but someone new. He did not stumble or swagger like the others. He moved with a quiet economy, his worn boots making little sound in the thick dust. May's eyes, trained to notice detail, took him in at once. He was tall and broad, but carried himself with a stillness that made him seem a part of the landscape, like a weathered rock formation. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that seemed carved from sun-baked timber, all hard planes and deep-set lines. A thick, untrimmed beard covered his jaw, and his clothes, a canvas shirt and denim trousers, were faded and patched, but clean. He was not a man of the town. He was a man of the empty spaces, of the silence she saw on the horizon. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, not with the leering curiosity of the others, but with a flat, unreadable assessment. It was just as objectifying, in its own way, but it lacked malice. It was the look of a man evaluating a tool or a horse. He looked at her silk dress, then at her face, and a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or resignation, passed through his eyes before they became placid again. He turned his attention to the saloon doors, waiting. May remained perfectly still. a statue of crimson silk, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. This was the man. She knew it with an instinct that went deeper than reason. This was the one she had been sold to. Mr. Silas Stone finally spilled out of the saloon, his face flushed with whiskey and cheap victory. He was holding a piece of paper, a deed, and he waved it like a triumphant flag. He saw the tall man waiting, and his grin widened, a slash of predatory glee. Ah, Elias, there you are. Thought you might have turned tail and run. Mr. Stone's voice was slick with false bonhomie. The man, Elias, said nothing. His silence was a presence, heavier and more potent than any words. Mr. Stone seemed not to notice, or perhaps he enjoyed playing to an unresponsive audience. He gestured grandly toward May. Well, here she is, the prize from our little wager, a genuine Oriental flower, all for you. A bit weathered from the journey, perhaps, but she'll do for a man like you. He let out a wet chuckle. Something to keep that lonely homestead of yours warm, eh? Elias's gaze moved from Mr. Stone's gloating face to the deed in his hand, and then, for a long moment, back to May. He saw the stiff pride in her posture, the way she refused to lower her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands that she tried so desperately to conceal. He saw the expensive, ridiculous dress and the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He had lost a bet over a card game, a stupid, drunken mistake. He had wagered a month's credit at the general store against whatever nonsense Stone had put up. He had not expected this. He had expected a deed to a useless patch of scrubland or a broken down mule. He looked at the woman, then back at the smirking man who had just sold a human being as a joke. A cold, quiet anger began to smolder in Elias's chest, an old fire he thought had long since burned out. He reached out and took the deed from Stone's hand. He did not look at it. He simply folded it and tucked it into his shirt pocket. His movements were deliberate, final. Mr. Stone's grin faltered slightly at the lack of reaction. Well, nothing to say? You've won, man. Elias's eyes, the color of a winter sky, finally met Stone's. The wager is settled, he said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together, the sound of a thing long unused. It was the first time May had heard him speak. The words were simple, but they carried an unnerving weight. He turned his gaze back to May. My wagon broke an axle a mile out. There is only the horse. This was the first complication, the first test. She looked from his implacable face to the sturdy mare tied to the post. There was no wagon, no carriage, no pretense of comfort or civilization. There was only this harsh man and his animal. The journey to his homestead, a place she could not even imagine, would be made on the back of that horse, with him. She could protest. She could cry, or scream, or refuse. She had seen other women do so, and she had seen the swift, brutal consequences. Such displays were a sign of weakness, an invitation for more cruelty. Mr. Silas Stone watched, hoping for a scene, for the punchline of his joke to finally land. May looked at Elias, at the grim set of his jaw, and saw not cruelty, but a weary pragmatism. The world was hard, and he was a hard man made to survive in it. She gave a single sharp nod, a flicker of something, surprise, maybe even a sliver of reluctant respect, passed through Elias's eyes before it was gone. He had expected tears or hysterics. He had been prepared for a fight. This silent, stoic acceptance was unsettling. It was not the reaction of a fragile doll. He untied the mare, his movements fluid and certain. He swung himself into the saddle with an easy grace, then looked down at her, his hand outstretched. It was a large, calloused hand, scarred and stained with the work of the land. It was not a gentleman's hand offered in courtesy. It was a functional offer of leverage, nothing more. May hesitated for only a second. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, impersonal. He pulled her up with surprising strength, settling her behind him on the horse's rump. Her silk dress bunched awkwardly, the fine fabric an absurdity against the coarse leather of his saddle and the rough denim of his trousers. The town watched them, a gallery of silent, judging faces. Mr. Stone's laughter finally came, loud and derisive, as the horse turned and began to walk away from the only lights and noise for 100 miles. The sound was swallowed by the vast, waiting silence of the plains. The town of Redemption shrank behind them, its ugly, false fronted buildings dissolving into the shimmering heat. Soon, the only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of the mare's hooves on the hard packed earth, the creak of leather, and the whisper of the wind through the brittle, sun scorched grass. The world opened up, a terrifying expanse of earth and sky that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. The sun beat down, relentless, and the horizon was a wavering line that never seemed to get any closer. May held on to the back of the saddle, her knuckles white, her body rigid with the effort of staying upright. Each jolt of the horse's gait was a fresh agony, jarring her bones and chafing her skin. The silence between them was a physical presence, a wall built of his stoicism and her fear. She watched the back of his head, the way the sun had bleached the tips of his dark hair, the rigid line of his shoulders. He rode with an innate confidence, a man perfectly at home in this desolate wilderness. He was a part of it, weathered and unyielding. His vigilance was constant. His eyes, she knew, were scanning the horizon, reading the subtle language of the land, a shift in the wind, a distant dust cloud, the flight of a bird. He was a hunter, or the hunted. Here there was little difference. She, in turn, felt his awareness of her. He felt the tension in her body, the way she flinched at every unexpected sound. He had expected complaints, weeping. He got only silence. A stubborn, resilient silence that was beginning to feel heavier than any protest. The landscape was a character in their silent drama, a third passenger on the horse. It was a brutal, beautiful thing. The plains rolled on, a sea of pale grass dotted with hardy scrub and the occasional skeletal remains of a long dead tree. The sky was a vast, empty canvas that dwarfed them, making them feel as small and insignificant as insects. It mirrored the desolation in May's heart, the vast emptiness where her past life had been. Yet there was a strange peace in it, too. The land did not judge, it did not leer or mock, it simply was. Its indifference was a strange sort of comfort after the suffocating contempt of the town. She was no longer a spectacle, merely a small moving speck in an enormous world. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The heat began to relent, replaced by a creeping chill that promised a cold night. Elias finally reined the mare to a halt near a small gnarled copse of trees huddled around a trickle of a stream. He dismounted in one smooth motion, his body showing no sign of the fatigue that May felt in every fiber of her being. She slid awkwardly from the horse's back, her legs trembling and weak. She nearly fell, but caught herself on the saddle, her pride refusing to let her show such weakness. He did not offer to help, but he watched her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He led the mare to the stream, letting her drink deeply. Then he unstrapped a water skin from the saddle. He walked over to May, who stood stiffly by a tree, and held it out to her. He did not speak, but the gesture was clear. It was the first act of provision, of care, however small. She took the skin, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough as bark. She drank, the lukewarm water a balm to her parched throat. It tasted of leather and dust and life itself. When she was finished, she handed it back. Thank you, she whispered. The words were a rustle of dry leaves, barely audible, the first she had spoken to him. He gave a curt nod, his eyes lingering on her for a moment, before he turned away to tend to his horse. That single nod, that brief shared drink of water, was a crack in the wall of silence. It was not kindness, not yet, but it was the absence of cruelty, and in her world, that was a precious thing. They did not ride on. He built a small smokeless fire from dry scrub, its heat a welcome comfort against the encroaching night. From his saddlebags, he produced a strip of dried meat and a hard biscuit, which he broke in two and handed to her. They ate in the same silence they had traveled in, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft cropping of the mare. The stars began to appear, scattered across the black velvet sky like spilled diamonds, more numerous and brilliant than any she had ever seen. They were cold, distant, and beautiful. In their silent, uncaring light, she felt the last of her old life burn away, leaving only the raw, aching reality of the present. She was here, in the middle of nowhere, with a stranger who owned the deed to her life. And yet, for the first time since she had left her home, she did not feel like she was on display. She was just a woman, huddled by a fire, trying to survive. When the first light of dawn broke, a pale gray smear on the eastern horizon, they were already moving. The journey continued, another long day of silence and endurance. But something had subtly shifted between them. The silence was less of a wall and more of a shared space. He seemed to notice the way she instinctively leaned with the horse, her body learning the rhythm of the ride. She noticed the way he would occasionally shift in the saddle, a subtle movement to shield her from the worst of the wind. They were two solitary beings, moving through a vast emptiness, bound together by a ridiculous piece of paper and the shared, unspoken imperative to survive. It was twilight when they finally arrived. They crested a low rise, and below them, nestled in a shallow valley, was the homestead. It was not what she had imagined. There was no grand ranch house, no bustling activity. There was only a small, sturdy looking cabin built of dark, weathered logs, a larger barn, and a few corrals. A thin curl of smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney, a lonely signal in the immense wilderness. The place looked as solitary and self contained as the man who lived in it. As they drew closer, May's heart sank. This was it. This was her new cage, even smaller and more isolated than any she had known before. The emptiness of the plains had been terrifying, but this concentrated desolation felt suffocating. Elias reined in the mare in front of the main cabin and dismounted. He stood for a moment, looking at his home as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps through her eyes. He saw its starkness, its lack of any softening touch. It was a fortress against the wilderness, not a home. He then turned and walked, not to the front door of the main cabin, but to a much smaller structure a short distance away. It was little more than a hut, a simple square of logs with a single window and a door. He pushed the door open. It was dark inside. He disappeared for a moment, and then a faint light flickered to life, the warm glow of a lantern. He reemerged and stood by the door, waiting for her. May slid from the horse, her body a single comprehensive ache. She walked toward him on unsteady legs, her borrowed time as a traveler over. This was the destination. He gestured toward the small cabin. "This is yours," he said, his voice as rough as ever. He held out a heavy iron key. "The lock is on the inside." This was the moment, the turning point. It was an act of profound, unexpected honor. He was not leading her into his bed. He was not imprisoning her in his house. He was giving her a space of her own, a door she could lock against him, against the world. He was acknowledging her as a person with a right to her own safety, her own privacy. He was telling her, without saying the words, that he was not a threat. She took the key. Its metal was cold and solid in her palm. She looked from the key to his shadowed face, trying to understand the man behind this gesture. He met her gaze for a second, his own eyes unreadable. Then he turned and walked toward the main cabin without another word. May pushed open the door to her new home and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of dry wood and sage. The cabin was Spartan, containing only a narrow cot with a clean wool blanket, a small table with a single chair, and a stone fireplace. A fire was already laid, waiting for a match. On the table sat a tin plate with bread, cheese, and a dried apple, next to a pitcher of fresh water. He had prepared this. He had anticipated her arrival, not as a possession, but as a person with needs. Warmth, food, water, security. He had provided for her without intruding, without demanding anything in return. The knot of fear in her stomach, the one that had been her constant companion for months, began to loosen, just a little. She closed the door, and the sound of the heavy bolt sliding home was the first sound of freedom she had ever known. Days melted into a week, then two, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. A silent routine established itself between the two solitary cabins. Every morning, she would find a small pail of fresh milk and 2 eggs on her doorstep, left sometime in the pre-dawn grayness. From her window, she watched him. His life was a testament to relentless work. He moved from dawn until dusk, his energy a force of nature. He mended fences, tended to his small herd of cattle, chopped wood, and worked the stubborn soil of a small vegetable garden. He moved with a deep, ingrained competence, a man who knew his land and his tasks so intimately They were a part of him. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Her observation of him evolved. At first, she watched him with the wary eye of a captive studying her jailer. But Elias was no jailer. He never approached her cabin, never tried to speak to her beyond a curt nod if their paths happened to cross at a distance. He respected the boundary he had drawn as if it were a canyon. Her fear slowly transmuted into a kind of analytical curiosity. She began to see the man beneath the harsh exterior. She saw the way he spoke to his horse, his voice a low, gentle rumble that was entirely different from the grating rasp he used for words. She saw the almost tender way he handled a newborn calf. And sometimes, in the quiet moments of twilight, when he thought he was alone, she would see him stand and stare at the western horizon. His shoulders slumped, a profound and bottomless melancholy radiating from him like cold from a block of ice. She saw a man hollowed out by a loss she could not comprehend. Inside her small cabin, May began to reclaim her own agency. The first few days she had done nothing but rest, allowing her bruised and aching body to heal. But idleness was a poison. She began to clean the small space with a meticulousness that was a quiet act of rebellion. She scrubbed the floor, washed the single window until it gleamed, and organized the few provisions she had. This tiny cabin was her territory, the first she had ever been able to claim. It was a kingdom of one room, and she was its queen. She began to venture out, exploring the immediate surroundings of her cabin. She found patches of wild herbs, recognizing them from the teachings of her grandmother, a woman who had valued practical knowledge over porcelain beauty. She gathered them, her hands remembering the old rhythms of sorting and drying. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, she found a piece of fallen cottonwood, its grain smooth and pale. Back in her cabin, using the small knife Elias had left for her to cut her bread and cheese, she began to carve. Her father had forbidden it, calling it a peasant's hobby, but her grandfather had taught her, his gnarled hands guiding hers, showing her how to read the wood, how to coax a shape from its heart. The slivers of wood fell away, and slowly, a small intricate bird began to take shape under her patient fingers. It was an act of creation, of pure self. She was not a commodity, not a prize, not a flawed product. She was a woman who could find herbs and carve birds from forgotten pieces of wood. She was a person. The next morning, when she retrieved the milk and eggs, she left the small wooden bird in their place. It was a tiny thing, perched on the rough-hewn wood of the step, its head cocked as if listening. It was an offering, a bridge across the silent gulf between their two cabins. It was not payment, not a plea. It was a declaration. I am here. I am a person. This is what I can do. She watched from her window as Elias approached. He stopped, his gaze falling on the bird. He stood looking at it for a long, still moment. He did not touch it at first. He simply looked, his head tilted. Then, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his large, calloused hands, he picked it up. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the delicate lines of its wings. He looked toward her cabin, his expression hidden by the shadow of his hat, and then he put the small carving into his shirt pocket, the one over his heart. He picked up the empty pail and walked away. A week later, he approached her cabin in the middle of the day. It was the first time he had done so. May's heart leaped into her throat, a reflexive flicker of the old fear. She stood in the doorway, watching him come, her hands clenched at her sides. He stopped a few feet away, holding the deed she had seen in Silas Stone's hand. He did not speak. He simply took a match from his pocket, struck it on his boot heel, and set the corner of the paper on fire. They both stood and watched as the flames consumed the legal document that had defined her existence. The black ashes of the words that had bound her scattered on the wind. When it was gone, he finally met her eyes. His were clear, the color of a winter storm. "You are not owned," he said, his voice low and steady. "You are free to leave, but winter is coming. The passes will be snowed in soon. It is not safe." He turned and walked away, leaving her with a choice. He had not just burned a piece of paper, he had burned her prison. Her continued presence here was no longer a matter of ownership, but of her own volition. She watched his retreating back, and for the first time, she saw not a captor, but a protector. The first snows came early that year. a fine white powder that dusted the high peaks and sharpened the air with a biting chill. The world shrank, the vast plains now a canvas of white and gray under a heavy, oppressive sky. The silent routine continued, but it was now underpinned by a sense of shared purpose, an unspoken alliance against the coming cold. May began to expand her world beyond the cabin. She took over the tending of the small flock of chickens, her movements calm and sure, and she organized the root cellar, her practical mind seeing ways to make their stores last longer. Elias watched her, saying nothing, but he began leaving more for her: a sack of flour, a side of bacon, things that spoke of a shared future, of weathering the winter together. The inciting threat, when it came, was not from the wind or the snow. It came on horseback, three dark figures riding out of the gray afternoon, their forms stark against the white landscape. May saw them first from her window. Her blood ran cold. She recognized the swagger of the man in the lead, even from a distance. Silas Stone. He had come back. She did not hesitate. She ran from her cabin, her feet crunching in the thin layer of snow, and burst into Elias's house without knocking. He was cleaning a rifle at his main table, the metallic scent of gun oil sharp in the warm air. He looked up, his eyes instantly alert, seeing the raw fear on her face. "Three men," she said, her voice tight and breathless. "Stone is one of them." He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle. "Get in the cellar," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Bar the door." He moved toward the front of the cabin, his body a coiled spring of deadly intent. But May did not move toward the cellar. She looked at the rifle rack on the wall, where a second, smaller Winchester sat. Her father had been a cruel man, a merchant who saw his daughter as another item in his ledger. But his assets, human or otherwise, had to be protected. From the age of 10, he had forced her to shoot, drilling her for hours in the hot sun until her arms ached and her shoulder was a mass of bruises. He wanted a guard dog in a silk dress. He had gotten one. "No," she said, her voice steady now, the fear burned away by a cold, clear resolve. She walked to the rack and took down the rifle. She checked the action with a fluid, practiced motion that made Elias stop and stare. "I can shoot." He looked at her, at the grim determination in her eyes, the confident set of her hands on the weapon, and saw not the fragile doll from Redemption, but a wolf who had been wearing a sheep's skin. There was no time to question it. He gave a single sharp nod. "Take the back window. They will try to flank. Do not fire until I do." They were no longer a man and his ward or an owner and his property. They were a garrison of two. The small cabin, once his solitary fortress, was now their shared ground, a place to be defended. The forced proximity was absolute, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the unspoken terror of the fight to come. Silas Stone and his two hired guns rode into the yard with an arrogant confidence, assuming they were facing a single, isolated rancher. "Elias!" Stone's voice boomed, falsely cheerful. "We've come to collect my property. Seems there was a misunderstanding about our little wager." A rifle shot cracked from the main cabin's window, splintering the top rail of the corral fence inches from Stone's head. The shot was not a warning, it was a declaration of war. The two gunmen scattered, diving for cover behind a water trough and a stack of firewood, returning fire. The quiet homestead erupted into a symphony of violence. The sharp retort of rifles, the whine of ricocheting bullets, the splintering of wood. Elias worked his lever action with methodical, deadly efficiency. He was a man defending his land, his home, his solitude. But it was different now. He was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the quiet woman at the other window. He heard the crack of her Winchester, a sharper, higher-pitched sound than his own. He saw one of the gunmen, who had been creeping around the side of the barn, suddenly jerk and fall, a dark stain spreading on his chest. Elias did not have time for surprise. There was only the fight. They communicated without words, a language of gunfire and movement. He would lay down suppressing fire while she reloaded. She would pick off a target that he could not see. They moved in a deadly, intuitive dance, anticipating each other's needs, each other's actions. In the crucible of the battle, they were forged into a single cohesive unit. The fight was brutal and short. The second gunman made a desperate rush for the cabin and was cut down by their combined fire. Silas Stone, a coward at heart, was left alone, crouched behind the water trough, his bravado stripped away, leaving only raw, pathetic fear. This is a mistake, Elias, he shrieked. She's just a thing. She ain't worth dying for. Elias's answer was another bullet that chewed a chunk of wood from the trough near Stone's face. Stone scrambled onto his horse and fled, a craven retreat back into the gray emptiness from which he had come. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the drip of water from the bullet hole trough. The world outside was a